Good morning, afternoon, and evening, everyone. My name is Rebecca Miller, and I am the Regional Coordinator for Counter Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling with UNODC's Office for Southeast Asia and the Pacific based in Bangkok. And I'd very much like to extend a warm welcome to all of you to Day 3 of UNODC's Knowledge Week, which aims to stimulate discussions on the most salient issues around human trafficking and migrant smuggling with a range of experts. And indeed, we certainly have an incredible panel of experts with us today for this session, which is entitled Access to Justice and Protection for Smuggled Migrants. So as your moderator for this session, I will introduce our distinguished panelists in just a moment. But first, please allow me to briefly take a bit more of your time to explain why you've all been invited here today. So this is the first time UNODC has hosted a Knowledge Week, and the timing is no coincidence. These discussions are being held in advance of an intergovernmental working group sessions on trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants. And the 8th session of the working group on the smuggling of migrants will be held on the 14th and 15th of October in Vienna, and will address the impact that the availability of regular channels of migration have on reducing the demand for migrant smuggling, and how to strengthen the capacity to prosecute migrant smuggling cases. But before we get into the panel discussion, I would like to invite my colleague, Ms. Tiffany Crétin from our Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling section in Vienna to speak briefly about a background paper that was prepared by the Secretariat on the impacts of COVID-19 on the smuggling of migrants. Tiffany, the floor is now yours.
Thank you, Rebecca, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. I just have a few minutes in this session to present you a new publication, since I will not take time away from our great panel today. So our section is launching today a new paper that you will find in the chat soon on COVID-19 and the impact it has been having on the smuggling of migrants. We observed that the pandemic and all the means taken to stop it, such as border closures and a reduction of pathways for regular migration, have not led to a reduction in smuggling activities, but seem to have even helped some networks to take advantage of the situation of vulnerability of people on the move. So because of mobility restrictions and other containment measures, the dependence of migrants and refugees on smugglers for crossing borders seems to have increased in most regions of the world, in the absence also of any possible alternative, and also because the reasons, the drivers pushing people to migrate have remained the same and have even increased for some of them. A consequence of this is the greater exposure of migrants and refugees to aggravated forms of smuggling, such as violence, including sexual and gender-based violence, extortion, trafficking in persons, all sorts of abuses, and even death, as the panel will discuss in a minute. Another consequence is that smuggling networks have made huge profits by taking advantage of people on the move, for example, by increasing their fees. As states now gradually lift COVID-19 related restrictions, the establishment or re-establishment of pathways for regular migration offer an effective tool and a good preventive strategy to reduce the need to resort to smuggling networks to cross borders. And this way, it also lowers the risk of human rights violations and abuse for people on the move. It also enables states to keep control over their borders. We therefore encourage states to develop more or new pathways for regular migration. This is one of the recommendations of the paper in its last chapter. So I will not go more into detail now, but encourage you all to read it. It also exists in French and Spanish. This topic will be discussed on 8 December at the reconvened session of the Commission on Crime Prevention and Criminal Justice in Vienna, and we very much look forward to this thematic session. Finally, I would like to thank the US Department of State and its Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, INL, for its continuous support to the section and for making this study possible. So thank you very much, and looking forward to listening to the panelists now.
Thanks so much, Tiffany. And this is really exciting news to hear that UNODC has been putting out this paper. And I'm actually very excited to be reading it since it's being launched today. So no, thank you for that very pertinent overview. So now it is time to turn to our main discussion about the smuggling of migrants. So migrant smuggling, as we know, is a transnational organized crime that involves transporting another person illegally across a border for the purpose of achieving a financial or other material benefit, or in other words, profit. And it is defined by the Protocol Against the Smuggling of Migrants by Land, Sea, and Air, which supplements the UN Convention Against Transnational Organized Crime. UNODC is the guardian of the convention and its protocols, and we support countries to develop and implement a transnational and multifaceted response to prevent migrant smuggling, prosecute its perpetrators, and protect the rights of migrants. So much of UNODC's work on migrant smuggling, like the paper that Tiffany has talked about, this also includes research through our Smuggling of Migrants Observatory, a recent study on the impacts of gender on aggravated migrant smuggling offenses and responses, as well as a toolkit for mainstreaming human rights and gender equality into criminal justice responses to address both human trafficking and migrant smuggling. All of this work has revealed how violence is used by smugglers or other perpetrators as a form of punishment, intimidation, or coercion, and is often inflicted with no apparent reason. And unfortunately, we know that the modus operandi of smugglers can endanger the lives and safety of migrants or subject them to inhuman or degrading treatment. And tragically, reports of torture, sexual violence, extortion, exploitation, and even loss of life are not uncommon. And such situations are considered by the protocol to be aggravated smuggling. And this is one of the main reasons why a human rights approach to addressing migrant smuggling is so important. So it is now my honor and privilege to introduce our distinguished panelists. And all four are leaders and experts on human rights law and effective responses to migrant smuggling. So our first panelist today is Dr. Marika McAdam. And Marika is an independent international law and policy advisor who has worked globally with UNODC, IOM, OHCHR, Chatham House, and the Nexus Institute, among many others. And is currently serving as an advisor to the Valley Process Regional Support Office and the ASEAN Australia Counter-Trafficking Program. She is the author of several UNODC issue papers on the smuggling of migrants, as well as the Toolkit to Combat Smuggling of Migrants, the International Framework for Action to Implement the Smuggling of Migrants Protocol, and she is also the author of the toolkit that I was just talking about for mainstreaming human rights and gender equality into criminal justice interventions to address trafficking in persons and smuggling of migrants. Welcome, Marika. Our second panelist is Vasilis Karatsitosis, and Vasilis is a human rights lawyer and the legal representative for the applicants in the Chowdhury and 42 others versus Greece case. So this case, which Vasilis brought to the European Court of Human Rights, concerns irregular migrants from Bangladesh that were trafficked for the purpose of labor exploitation. And in addition to fighting for access to justice for exploited migrants, Valisis is the country director for the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society in Greece, which is an NGO that works to protect and support refugees, particularly cases involving the criminalization of humanitarian interventions. Welcome, Vasilis. Our third panelist is Danielle Hickman. And Danielle is a trial lawyer with the Human Rights and Special Prosecutions Section, or HRSP, in the Criminal Division of the U.S. Department of State. And HRSP prosecutes members of international criminal networks who seek to evade U.S. immigration laws. And Danielle joined the department in 2016 and was awarded the Assistant Attorney General's Award for Distinguished Service in 2019. Prior to this, she served for almost 14 years as a deputy district attorney in San Diego, California. And she also worked for the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees in London, and in 1999 participated in a war crimes document project in Kosovo for the International Crisis Group. Welcome, Danielle. And last, but certainly not least, is our fourth panelist, Professor François Crépeau. And François is full professor and Hans and Tamar Oppenheimer Chair in Public International Law at the Faculty of Law of McGill University in Canada. He is the director of the McGill Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism from 2015 to 2020. He is a member of the scientific community of the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights, the chair of the thematic working group on migrant rights and integrations in host communities, and a member of the advisory committee of the International Migration Initiative, the Open Society Foundations. And if you're not impressed already, from 2011 to 2017, Francois was the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Migrants. Welcome, Francois. So a sincere thank you to all of the panelists for joining us today for what I know is going to be a very interesting discussion. So how things are going to run is that I have 4 questions that I'm going to ask each of the panelists, and each panelist will have 2 minutes to reply. And if there's time left, I will either ask some questions that participants had submitted in advance when they registered for this event, or take some questions from the chat function. So if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. So on that note, we have about 45-50 minutes for what I know is going to be a fantastic discussion. And I'm going to direct my first question to Marika and then to the rest of the panelists. But Marika, you can kick us off. And the question is, what kind of violence and abuses have you seen inflicted upon smuggled migrants?
Thank you for the question, Rebecca, and for the intimidating honor of kicking off the response. Where to begin? I think I have to only reiterate what you and Tiffany have said in your opening comments. And we've seen violence and abuse directed at smuggled migrants at the hands not just of smugglers, but also by state officials, by private actors, including other migrants en route. I think it's worth gender domestic place here, both sexual violence and indeed en route. We've seen groups separated by sex en route and then subject to different types of abuse, different types of torture. Sexual violence against women, of course, is more prevalent than it is towards men, but exists too. And as you said before, not all of this violence has a point, and that was a key finding of a recent UNODC study on this. Another UNODC study in the region I work in, which is Southeast Asia at the moment, pointed to the role of corruption, particularly along border areas, and abuse and violence that happens there from state officials who are facilitating smuggling. And indeed, in our region now, we are rife with examples here. The jungle camps across the Thai-Malaysia border, for instance, and the extortion that Rohingya refugees have been subject to and caught up in a web of extortion and cover-ups is a key example. And indeed, also in this region, 2020 was one of the deadliest years for migrants who were smuggled, many of whom were stranded and abandoned at sea, both by smugglers, but also by state inaction. And the majority of people on board in those situations were women and children. And also in land situations, we have examples, including from citizens from this region, Vietnamese who died en route to the UK in the back of a truck. And these are just examples I point to highlight the horror and emphasize the point that the aggravated circumstances that are specified in Article 6, subsection 3 of the smuggling protocol do indeed represent the reality of what happens. And that is endangerment of lives and safety and acts that entail inhuman and degrading treatment. And so I think the point that I return to and the one that I opened with is not only is this abuse happening at the hands of smugglers, but it is also happening at the hands of others, contrary to the obligations that states have committed to protect life and the right not to be subject to torture, which is captured in the smuggling protocol, and indeed to prevent their own agents from participating in such crimes. But the reality is that many severe abuses happen not just at the hands of smugglers, but with the complicity or even participation of state agents and other actors. 2 minutes, I hope.
Amazing start, Marika. No, thank you for those insights and those observations of what we're seeing and dealing with in Southeast Asia. Valisis, please.
Vasilis.
What kind of violence are you seeing and abuses you've been inflicted upon smuggled migrants?
First of all, thank you for your invitation in such an interesting issue. I would like to share my experience in Lesbos Island together with my colleagues. Apart from the recent incidents of pushbacks at sea, since there are testimonies of refusal of entry or of entry procedures, of avoidance of formal procedures in Greek legal order. Keep in mind that Lesbos is the hotspot, acts as a hotspot for the whole European Union. I would like to brief you a little bit about the procedures in the last couple of years, since some years ago, despite the fact that, as you may know, there is the Reception Conditions Directive applicable to all those who manage to cross the national border in order to seek asylum. We have seen cases of detention after the entry in the Greek territory, administrative detention, detention upon arrival. Also, during March 2020, just before COVID first lockdown globally, Greece has decided to suspend for 30 days the Geneva Convention, meaning that all more than 1,000 people who had by coincidence entered that period have been detained on criminal grounds because they have been prosecuted for illegal entry, despite the fact that obviously they were victims of smuggling. Last but not least, those who were detained, some of them are still in criminal detention, and some others in the recent years have been prosecuted as smugglers themselves while they were smuggling. They were in this smuggling route. Keep in mind that Greece, despite other European countries, has no any safe legal entry procedure in Greek territory, not even the checkpoint of Evros in the Land Border Acts as an official checkpoint to seek asylum, meaning that the only way to access to protection is to make this illegal border crossing. So we have seen and we have defended refugees that have been prosecuted as criminals for illegal entry. And on the other hand, we have seen some of them to be in jail for maybe more than 100 years since the human smuggling in Greek legal order, following the UN protocol, became maybe the strictest crime in Greek legal order, because every person counts for 2 years in jail. And in case of death, the penalties are extremely high. There are testimonies right now since the last 2 years about pushbacks, and we are trying to follow up some of these cases. And sometimes not only pushbacks on the territorial waters, but people who manage to land in Greek territory are being illegally deported without any provision following according to Returns Directive, any safeguard.
I may pause you there. Oh, okay. Last point, because a number of your points we're going to come back to and you can elaborate on. Yes.
Because the new pact being discussed right now in European level, in my personal opinion, there is no any provision about safe legal entry procedures in order to combat human smuggling also. Because, as I told you, it was the only way to seek asylum through the use of human smuggling networks. On the contrary, there are only provisions about the long-term residence permit and the EU pool for talents and the blue card. Migrants who, in my opinion, could even migrate even before and without the use of smuggling networks.
Well, thank you, Vasilis. As I said, we're going to come back to a number of the points that you've touched upon, for example, the criminalization of smuggled migrants in some of our other questions. So no, looking forward to those elaborations. Thank you for those points. Danielle, let's turn to you now for a U.S. North American perspective.
Thank you, Rebecca, and may I say I'm truly honored to be speaking with this group today and with such distinguished colleagues on this panel. It's truly an honor. From our perspective, I am, as a prosecutor with the Department of Justice, we do prosecute these kinds of cases, and I can tell you firsthand some of the cases that I have seen have included some of the things that Marika has pointed to and touched on already, which include sexual abuse, torture, extortion, child abuse, child exploitation. We have the sexual and physical violence against women and men, of course, and also the mental abuses that people suffer. I think many of these individuals who are the smugglers capitalize on the fact that people are passing through countries in a clandestine manner, and so the idea that they could be victimized or that there may be threats against family members back home if they have utilized a certain type of network. I think those also fall into the kinds of mental abuses that we've seen. So I think there's a very wide range of physical and mental abuses that do occur. And that also includes things that you see once people maybe reach, for example, stateside, where you have a number of individuals crammed into small vehicles or semi-trucks, people who have crashed through the fence, rolled the vehicles, and people have died in fiery crashes because of the nature of the manner in which they're being smuggled. People who have been put into compartments on the metal plates under the engines, so they've actually suffered physical burns, and fatal burns. So you see a wide range of abuses, and I think largely due to the fact that these networks are so indiscriminate. The care of the people that they're smuggling is not their priority. It's really the financial part of it. So they just look at them as a means, and sadly, that means that many of the people who are utilizing these networks are targeted in such abusive ways.
No, thank you for sharing that, Danielle. Francois, over to you.
Thank you. I'd like to go to the source of this violence. The violence comes in great part from the fact that host states, North and South, do not acknowledge their real labor needs. If you have people who need to go because of violence or poverty, and you have millions of employers who are ready to employ them on the other side of the border, and you put a barrier between these two needs, you create underground markets. Migrants are smart. They do not go to countries where they cannot establish a future for themselves or their families in most cases. When states do not offer mobility options, others will. And so states are in great part responsible for the smuggling. This is a policy-induced phenomenon, just like the sale of alcohol during Prohibition time. Many Montreal families made a fortune because of that. And it stopped after 13 years when the administration realized it was going nowhere. We have the same problem with the war on drugs at present. And some countries, including Quebec, have established public agencies to sell cannabis in order to take that market away from the mafia. So states are actually subsidizing the mafias that are creating this violence and this exploitation by, as was mentioned, recruiters, loan sharks, employers, lodgers, smugglers, officials, etc. And in great part, although they won't acknowledge it, states are responsible for the death and the violence. In great part, not only, it takes two to tango. But we see that Boris Johnson recently said that he didn't want low-wage migrants. And my premier in Quebec said he didn't want any migrants with an income below $57,000 a year because this was the median salary and he didn't want to lower it. That's the kind of irresponsible thing that creates the underground markets and that creates the violence.
Thank you, Francois. You've already been giving some good thinking and salient points, I think, for our discussions next week in relation to the working group and the need to access safe, affordable, and legal migration channels in relation to as a measure to combat smuggling of migrants and prevent smuggling of migrants. But very much in this region, and I think a key point that I've taken away from these questions is in relation to, you know, states are very concerned about protecting the sovereignty of their borders and not necessarily thinking beyond the potential implications of that. So thank you all for those very insightful answers. I know that we're even just warming up on this one. So your second question, and Danielle, I'm going to start with you for this one. So what have the responses been? What obstacles exist that hinder access to justice for smuggled migrants?
Thank you for the question, and I'll start with the second part first because I think it plays into the responses. So I think one of the things that hinders the access to justice is the nature of the smuggling network itself and how these are run, because you have individuals who are migrants who are using these networks who are not passing through these countries legally, and so they don't have documentation. So there's the fear that if they go to law enforcement, if they've been victimized, that they will somehow be penalized and criminalized because they have reported their abuses. So I think the primary obstacle is the fear itself and the inability to access justice where they are. And so that plays into the first part of your question, which is what have some of the responses been? In my work, we have a couple of different tools that we use. So for example, we have international prosecutions. I can think of 3 cases in particular, one of which is one that I did with great assistance from Colombia, where we had a smuggling network that was smuggling Cubans through Colombia to the United States. And this particular network in this instance, we're smuggling 3 individuals, 2 men and a woman. These individuals took them to a secluded place, raped and murdered the woman, raped one of the other men, and the third man, who did survive, had been hung over the side of the boat listening to all of this happening and could do absolutely nothing to save his girlfriend. He escaped by, I think, just sheer will. Swam into the dark waters. They hunted him. They looked for him. He walked out through the jungle and went to find law enforcement for the sole purpose of trying to get justice for his girlfriend who had died so tragically. And because of that one individual and his will, the police were activated in Colombia. They did find these smugglers, and the Fiscalia prosecuted them in Colombia for the murders. And then we worked with Colombia and extradited those individuals to the United States and prosecuted them for the smuggling with the deaths attached. So those individuals are now serving 15, 45, and 50 years in prison, where then they will go back to Colombia afterwards and serve their Colombian sentences. I think that case in particular, I think really illustrates the cooperation, the international cooperation effort to combat this particular network. And I point to that one in particular because the individual that ran the network used social media and the fact that people knew each other, that he'd smuggled before, as a way to entice people to use his network and to engender some form of trust. So he was capitalizing on their vulnerabilities and luring them into a situation where they ultimately were either severely abused or had died. There are other cases where we have worked in partnership with foreign authorities to gain foreign evidence that may be part of a network prosecution, and secured prosecutions for individuals who had forced several people, 150 people, onto a boat with no life jackets and people who couldn't swim, and basically said, you're on your own, and left them out there to drown or to, at significant risk. So these international efforts, I think, are just one example of the way that the United States has tried to work to hold these perpetrators accountable, and also to seek the justice for the victims who may not be able to get it in the places where they are.
Now, thank you, Danielle, for that really interesting case of international cooperation. And unfortunately, I think in my many years that I've worked in this space, we have too few examples of international cooperation in relation to addressing this particular issue. So no, thank you for highlighting that case. Marika, same question to you.
And completely different answer, Beck. I found that so extraordinary to hear Danielle's insights there, because it stands in such stark contrast to what I want to say about this from the perspective of my region. I mean, here I think the key barriers of access to justice are probably the same ones that you cited, Danielle. We've got lack of information about what the rights are in order to seek justice in the first place, but we've also got the fear of criminalization that deters reporting, and it's not a false fear, it's a very real fear. And it's based on an understandable lack of trust in the justice system in many places. And I think to sort of pan out from that, the two big problems that I would like us to focus more on include capacity and apathy. And on capacity, we see so few of what you were just describing, Danielle. We see so few convictions of aggravated smuggling. And the reality is that many states don't have laws to prosecute aggravated smuggling, or they do and they don't use them. But beyond that, also what we see is that there's so rarely prosecutions of the standalone crimes that they could be pursuing that happen in smuggling of migrants, including assault, battery, rape, murder, manslaughter, these things that we're mentioning. So often those things are existing in penal codes, but they're not being pursued. So I think this speaks to a wider problem beyond smuggling frameworks being insufficient, but there are wider issues at play here. And the reality is that in many countries, access to justice is insufficient even for citizens, let alone for migrants, in a regular situation who face the additional challenge of also being viewed as criminals in some jurisdictions. There are barriers aplenty. And on the second point I raised, which is that of apathy, or perhaps deprioritization is another way of looking at it. I think the reality in so many states is that counter-smuggling is just not a priority. And many, if not most, I think, of the states that are yet to become party to the smuggling protocol are in this region here in the Asia Pacific. And one concern that I constantly encounter in this resistance to becoming party to the smuggling protocol and that framework that would facilitate that international cooperation that you were talking about, Danielle, is this concern that by becoming party to these instruments, that will trigger a whole series of obligations and pressures to do more for migrants and to pursue these interests that some states perceive as being contrary to their own interests and contrary to the interests of their citizenry. And I guess this relates to the fact that states, quite reasonably understand their primary obligation as being to their voting citizens, and they don't want to burden already strained resources because they fail to understand so many of the dimensions that Francois was mentioning in his previous intervention. And added to this thing in this region, this perception that migrants have somehow, they're in a situation of their own making. They've willingly taken these risks. They've willingly set out on these dangerous journeys. And that, I think, has contributed to their stigmatization, and it fuels this apathy that in many cases, I think, is moving towards animosity. And of course, we all know that a person's rights are not relinquished just because they pay to be smuggled, of course. And in an ideal world, in my view, the extent to which even migrants in irregular situations can access justice would be a wonderful measure by which the health of a state's criminal justice system could be measured. However, I think we're a long way off that in the real world. Thanks, Beck.
No, thank you, Marika. Sadly, I think I do agree with you, and certainly those does link very nicely to a lot of the points that Francois did make in relation to perceptions around migrants and their ability to contribute to society, and the fact that this has become such a politicized issue in relation to which political power is going to be voted in. So Francois, over to you. What are your views on this particular question and responses to the smuggling of migrants issue?
Again, I'll take the high altitude perspective. With 40 years of globalization, we have delocalized manufacturing to countries where labor costs are much lower. But you can't delocalize agriculture, care, construction, hospitality, extraction, fisheries, where most of the smuggling happens. And though what has happened is that we have delocalized labor conditions from the south to the north, or from countries, low-wage countries or low-income countries to higher income countries, because that concerns host states in the north and in the south. This is a strategy, and it wasn't a strategy at the beginning. It was a business strategy, not a government strategy, but it has become a government strategy, really, to reduce labor costs. It's constructed precarity through a regime that produces undocumented migrants, and now we have legalized that in a regime that produces temporary migrant workers, which have a precarious status themselves. For example, the kafala system or the single employer sponsorship system. And it results from a combination of two fields of law which do not interact well at official level. Immigration law, with the criminalization of undocumented migrants. If you have no status and a precarious status, you fear to be deported. That's what Marika was mentioning. Fear is the key factor in creating the smuggling mechanism. And labor law, which is not applied. So it's these two systems that do not function together. Labor law is already not applied to many citizens at low wages, but it's not applied systematically, and I would say systemically, to migrants. Labor inspections are ineffective. Unionization is discouraged or prohibited, and there's no help to access justice whatsoever. We know that millions of employers are employing millions of undocumented migrants, and we do nothing. States do not care how they're treated. This is a strategy of disempowerment to keep labor costs low for good parts of our economy. Labor rights will only be realized if we empower the workers. That's what's happened at the end of the 19th and beginning century and beginning of 20th century for nationals. Unionization, access to justice, right to protest, contest, to strike. But you can't do that if you fear being deported at the first, at the first time you protest. Criminalization, repression of undocumented migrants pushes them further underground in the hands of their exploiters. We are compounding the problem instead of resolving it. It silences the migrants, it disempowers them. And that, to me, is the key issue that states do not want to resolve.
No, thank you, Francois. Again, many very valid and interesting points there. And I pick up on the deportation of irregular migrants, smuggled migrants, even victims of trafficking, which unfortunately is very prevalent in many countries, not just in this Southeast Asia region, but also in many parts of the world. So, Vasilis, I'm sure you have many insights into this question. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. In fact, if at least in our country, if you do not pass the threshold of trafficking or particularly exploitative labor conditions, there is no notion of victim of smuggling in Greek legal order. As I mentioned before, most of the smuggled migrants, if they are lucky, they enter, let's say, the asylum procedure in the speedy border procedure, because, of course, the public prosecutor had already refrained from prosecuting them for the illegal entry. But if they are not lucky, they are being prosecuted as for the illegal entry, or in worst case scenario, as smugglers themselves. They criminalize even the humanitarian help sometimes, because the smuggling networks adapt easily, and they send someone from the migrants to lead the boat. But in fact, only if you are recognized by the public prosecutor as a victim of trafficking, you are entitled of some rights like residence permit, etc. But this is also very difficult because there is a very bad practice in Greek and I would say also in European jurisprudence. Those phenomena Professor Crepeau has described, it was they are very difficult to be recognized as such. In our case, Chaudhry case, it was, let's say, extremely difficult to finally end with this conclusion that these people were victims of trafficking. Before becoming victims of trafficking, all these migrant workers, obviously, they were smuggled in agricultural sites of Greece in order to work directly. Since I'm following up this phenomena since 2013, I can assure you that some people are entering the land border and they go straight to the agricultural sites to work in the south of Greece. I'm talking about almost 800 kilometers. In our last intervention before the Committee of Ministers of Council of Europe, recognizing that there is no other solution because prosecutions are very difficult to be implemented in such areas, we have asked for an amendment of the Greek Immigration Code in order to include a legal labor scheme beyond the seasonal workers directive or employer sanctions, who are totally non-applicable in Greek reality and, in my opinion, in European reality in the last years of COVID.
No, thank you, Vasilis, for that. And I want to come back to a point that you've mentioned many times, and the other panelists have also mentioned many times, is the fact that smuggled migrants are often criminalized. And what impact do you think this has on smuggled migrants and the responses to smuggled migrants? And I actually want to continue with you, Vasilis. What do you think? The fact that smuggled migrants are often criminalized, what impact does this have on smuggled migrants and the responses to migrant smuggling?
In my opinion, the harder that government make to cross legally borders, national borders, the more criminal can charge other people in order to do so. Is totally non-effective, this policy. The only effective policy, in my opinion, of course, could be to refrain from any judicial proceedings against the smuggled migrants, because at the end of the day, these people are victims of these networks. They are not at all perpetrators. Given the fact that there is no other alternative way, at least in Greece. So this policy remains non-effective for most of them. And also the statistics show that the migrants and refugees they will continue to arrive in European Union, despite let's say the hostile environment is being created right now. The walls and the patrols, the border patrols at sea, the joint initiatives with Frontex, etc. I do not think that the phenomenon will stop. Maybe it will be more expensive and more dangerous.
No, thank you, Vasilis. I suspect Francois will have some points to agree with you on there. But Francois, what are your views on this question?
Taking the high altitude view as I've done, I want to talk about the Global Compact on Migration. Host states, especially in Europe, insist on 4 articles: the one on fighting smuggling, combating trafficking, securing borders, and facilitating returns. I have no qualm with that. But there are plenty of other articles in that Global Compact that say minimize drivers of migration, provide migrants with documentation, provide legal pathways, ensure fair recruitment, reduce vulnerabilities, and that means reduce criminalization in particular, save lives, minimize detention, provide access to basic services, including access to justice, and point 16, empower empower migrants. I've never seen this in any official documents before. Empower migrants, which is the only thing that will ever work. And so the whole thrust of the Global Compact is to facilitate mobility. The word facilitation is used 62 times in the Global Compact. We need to make the mobility simpler, safer, faster, and cheaper for everyone. And we're doing host countries, North and South, are doing the opposite. Now, this Global Compact was negotiated pretty much under the radar of politicians. They woke up maybe in the last months of after the text was negotiated, and it was negotiated by diplomats, civil servant experts who knew what they were talking about. And so it's not happenstance that you have this list of things that say empower migrants. And it's not science fiction either. This was the situation in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. There was no freedom of circulation. People had to show papers and visas at every border, including in Europe. And yet, Europe and North America welcomed millions of migrants from Africa, from Turkey, from Mexico, Central America. We welcomed millions, and they had to show papers, and they did. It's only when we thickened the borders that suddenly we were stuck with a problem of smuggling and undocumented migration. So it is important to remember that if states enable and empower migrants by providing what is in the global, what states have agreed they should do in the Global Compact, smuggling will be taken away from the hands of the mafias, and states will be able to create a system that they control, and they will end up doing what should be done, i.e. legalizing, regulating, and taxing mobility, which is the only thing that works for any human activity. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Francois. I'm going to be looking at the Global Compact on Migration work that we are facilitating as the UN in a different way. Interesting that 62 times facilitation is mentioned. I'm going to go and have another look at that with a different perspective. So thank you for that. Danielle, your views on this question?
I think some of my fellow panelists have touched on this. I think, as we've discussed, once the migrants are criminalized, it forces them into a position where they feel that they can't come forward, that they can't seek justice. And so they often are left with the victimizations that have happened to them without any sort of recourse. I think that has forced people into this. It's almost a vicious cycle in some ways, because it forces people into this expectation that this is how they're going to be treated, and that it somehow is okay, and it's not. And these abuses that are continually perpetrated on these migrants are horrific. And you will find too that in talking to some of them, they are, in some of my cases, they are aware that these were the potential things that could happen to them. And yet they felt so compelled that they would continue through, knowing that this was ahead of them. And in some cases, people would often try and explain away why they were victimized, as if it was their fault that they were victimized. And that's not the case, and it shouldn't be that way. People shouldn't feel like they somehow have done this to themselves. But yet, I think because migrants are criminalized, they internalize it and feel like it's somehow their fault. I think the inconsistencies, as some of my colleagues have pointed out, that not all states are members of UNTOC, and they don't, and the protocols, and they don't. There's inconsistencies in how things are dealt with in different countries, and I think that just continues. Like I said, this cycle where you see that people are criminalized by their actions, and so they feel like they can't have recourse. And then because one country might do something one way and another country might do something differently, I think that also aggravates the situation. So I think the fact that there is inconsistency is one of the largest problems. And again, that lack of access to justice for so many of these migrants, they have no place to go and nobody to speak for them.
No, thank you, Danielle. Actually, that feeds in many respects into our final question quite well, in terms of the fact that next week we have the working group discussions, and delegations will be discussing prevention measures, including legal pathways, which Francois, you've certainly talked a lot about as safeguards against and ill treatment of smuggled migrants. So what recommendations would you find important when discussing this issue? And I am going to turn to you first, Francois, in relation to this. So what recommendations would you find important when discussing this issue, and what messages do you have for the delegations?
It's not an easy issue to solve. We cannot do it overnight. Too many economic fields in our countries are addicted to cheap labor, and raising the labor costs dramatically overnight would kill, hundreds of thousands of businesses, including farms. We can't do this. We've been 40 years into this. We are going to have to deal with it over the long term. And that, to me, is one of the big issues. Mobility is always reactive. We are not doing the strategic planning of mobility like we're doing the strategic planning of infrastructure, education, healthcare, urbanization, etc. We're planning those fields 20 years, 30 years, 50 years in advance in order to check for objectives, benchmarks, investments, etc. We're not doing that for mobility. Canada is probably one of the best countries in the world planning its immigration levels 3 years in advance, and that's it's extraordinary. Now that's not going to work if we want to increase the labor costs, because that's what we need to do in agriculture, construction, etc. We have to do it progressively, slowly over 10, 20, 30 years. Maybe it should, for migrants, it should be faster than that, but for the economies, it has to be progressive. The problem is political. As Marika mentioned, I think, politicians will not be swayed by migrants because they don't vote. And they will gain points if they have anti-immigration policies. They will not gain points if they have pro-immigration policies. And that's an issue we've been having for 40 years. The extreme right is benefiting that at all times. So in the meantime, before states realize that this is in their interest in the long term, we need to count on everything that's been done on the ground by people like Vasilis and others who do great work. Civil society organizations, unions, the media, to allow the migrant voices to emerge and change the perceptions and the discourse at social level. And there are good practices. For example, in Quebec, last week, all children, whatever their immigration status, have now access to public health care. That was decided last week in Quebec. Access to education was provided 4 years ago. It was a big battle by civil society. In Qatar, allowing temporary migrant workers to change employers. Before that, they were sent back home if their employer was. That's a key thing. Whether it happens on the ground still to be verified, but the law changed and allows that. In California, unions representing undocumented migrants. Do you know that in Ontario and Quebec, agricultural workers do not have the right to unionize, whether they're nationals or foreign, because the vast majority of them are foreign? That's extraordinary, and it shouldn't happen. But in other places, unions are starting to represent people and freedom of movement zones, Mercosur, EU, ECOWAS, EGAD, SADC, trying to create mobility zones where people do not have. They might have to show papers, but they will have those papers. And that, to me, is the key point. Empowering them through proper legal status and capacity to go to labor law remedies mechanism, access to justice, etc. Thank you.
Thank you, Francois. Vasilis, your thoughts and recommendations.
I could speak, of course, I agree with Professor Crépeau. I would like to stress out that in European Union level, there are directives totally non-related to the reality. Apart from the fact that even the long-term resident status and blue card are not easily applicable in the European Union because they are completely new, the most iconic, let's say, directive, the seasonal workers directive, is not applicable because Greek employers are using undocumented migrants from the pool and from those who have been rejected from asylum procedure all the previous years. So why should, if I was a farmer, let's say, why should I try to bring someone from Pakistan or Bangladesh in order to work in my farm, since there is a large pool of undocumented workers already in Greek territory and in European territory. Thus, I would like to stress out that the European Pact from 2008 and the new one needs to include this mobility maybe provision, needs to include real and effective policies for applicable to the needs, and especially in the last 2 years after COVID, it was very difficult, and keep this in mind, even for the Greek farmers to bring even irregular workers, because the restrictions of movement were everywhere. This pool of workers, thousands of workers, are going everywhere in Greece, depending on season and needs, and they could not easily move. A promising practice maybe is now that they will give vaccination to even to undocumented migrants. It was not easy some months ago because it was related to some permanent or other type of social numbers. But still, in my opinion, we need to amend the legislative and the total prohibition of regularization schemes, because otherwise we cannot afford to deal with the reality.
Right. No, thank you, Vasilis. Danielle, your thoughts and final recommendations for the delegations.
I think a couple of things, and I think Marika has pointed to it as well as the other panelists, which is I think one of the things that needs to be addressed are some of the underlying root issues for the factors that encourage migrants to utilize these networks and to put them in harm's way. So looking at what's going on in the home countries, the political instability, the natural disasters, the criminality that's going on, the things that are really causing people to put themselves in these situations and to move forward and trying to seek a better place. So looking at what the root causes are. Additionally, I think international cooperation and continuing to work together in the exchange of information. From a prosecutorial standpoint, if we are going to continue to go after these organizations and try to continue to make an impact, that requires foreign law enforcement and partnerships to continue to work together to try and develop evidence and international cooperation in working on holding these networks accountable. So I think there's a number of things. And then also I think one of the things to consider too is, as my colleagues have said, that we need to ensure that there's access to humanitarian protection and looking at ways that we can approach this from a global perspective and trying to make sure that there are measures in place that protect people from these kinds of violence.
No, thank you, Danielle. And last but not least, Marika, you get a special 4 minutes because I actually realized I just missed you on the third question. So please shed some insights on both the criminalization and responses, because I think they will also likely tie into your recommendations that you might have for the delegations around prevention measures and perhaps legal pathways. But you are granted a special 4 minutes because the moderator was not diligent in her duty. So please, Marika, the floor is yours.
That's very kind, Beck, but I really don't think I need it. I think the other speakers did a much better job than I could have of addressing the criminalization point. And I think we're all in furious agreement that despite the fact that aggravated smuggling is not prosecuted, states still seem to be able to find resources to throw at prosecuting migrants for irregular migration crimes, to absolutely no benefit to states, and on the contrary, undermining their own capacity to combat smuggling. So go figure. But I think that was well covered. And on this fourth question about what our recommendations would be, again, I find myself here in furious agreement with my colleagues. I think that prevention of smuggling, of course, requires that smuggling services obviously have to be undercut by the safe and regular alternatives that are offered by states. We've all said that in one way or another. Safe and regular pathways, and of course by that we mean those that are affordable and are accessible. They are the closest thing that we have to a silver bullet to keep migrants out of the hands of smugglers. That's obvious. However, let's be realistic here. This is, as Francois has said, a very hard sell for countries who do not see more migration to be in their national interests. That's a reality. Therefore, I think what should be discussed is that I think delegates need to really get serious and have real conversations about the costs and benefits and the risks and the rewards of providing those legal pathways against their current efforts to prevent them. They need to do the maths. They need to figure out how legal pathways aren't just in the interest of migrants, because we can all talk about that endlessly. Of course they are, but they also need to unpack how they are in the interests of the states themselves and their citizens. And importantly too, I think that any cost or detriments of providing those pathways have to also be candidly considered, because to my mind, saying that migration is all good is just as nonsensical as saying that migration is all bad. We have to be able to have these real conversations. And so to balance interests and to make smart policies, and indeed to sell them to the voting populace, as Francois and I have been saying, requires that states actually really understand the true costs and benefits, the gains and the losses of these policies, and are able to constantly calibrate them to changed needs and shifting priorities. So I hope, in a sense, that the conversation broadens beyond talking about safe and regular migration as a means of preventing aggravated smuggling, but also addressing how well-managed migration can be a manifestation of state sovereignty rather than a threat to it. That's the conversation that needs to happen. And further, and perhaps in the same vein, I think discussing prevention of smuggling in the human rights context requires duty bearers, i.e. states, to understand that upholding the rights of smuggled migrants is not just an obligation of international law, but is instrumental in criminal justice response to smuggling. In other words, it's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do from a prevention perspective, as well as the right thing to do from a protection perspective. These two are not in conflict with each other, they come hand in hand. This is what the evidence tells us. So I think in essence, Rebecca, migrants are not going to become assets to states, any states of origin or destination, unless they are protected, and that means that their human rights are upheld. So I hope that the discussion will get strategic, will get pragmatic, and will discuss the instrumental value of upholding migrants' rights.
Perfectly said, Marika. Thank you so much. All of you have given, I think, the delegates a lot of food for thought for their discussions next week. And I want to take this opportunity to extend a huge thank you to all of you. We have come to our time, so there is no time to take any questions from the chat, but I was watching a lot of the pop-ups coming, and there's a rich dialogue that's been happening in the chat. A lot of people have been commenting on what you've said. They've added various perspectives, a lot of agreements on what you've brought to the table. So thank you so much for your insights today and taking the time to be on this panel. It really was a great discussion. I'm sure we could obviously go on for another hour. But I do want to encourage delegates and practitioners who will be participating in next week's working group discussions to consider what was discussed here today and to take these points forward into their deliberations as we move into the following week. So before we conclude, I also want to thank all of our donors who made these shared resources possible and the work of UNODC possible. And this includes the European Union, Germany, and the US of A. And of course, before everyone signs off, I really would like to ask everyone if you could just take a quick brief moment to complete a feedback questionnaire. It's been added to the chat already. It will only take you a couple of minutes, I promise, and it is completely anonymous. But since this is the first time we've done this Knowledge Week and had these salient discussions around smuggling and trafficking, we're very keen to get feedback on all the different sessions that have been held this week. And last but not least, a huge thanks to the UNODC team in Vienna for their very hard work behind the scenes. I know a lot of effort has gone into this, a lot of planning, a lot of preparation. So a big thanks to all of you. I hope everyone who has attended this session, we had a number of people, a record number of participants who have signed up for this. I hope you enjoyed the discussions as much as I did, and I encourage everyone to join us for day 4 of Knowledge Week on working together to unlock innovation. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day and night, and stay safe.